Progress.
This is assessment 3, OIM 503, operational improvement. My name's Cameron Gray, student number 004125512. The assessment task that I've been set here is to give 5 examples of things that I was looking forward to or expecting to learn. These are the 5 things that I have taken away and also met my expectations. Number 1 being digital operations and improvement, strategies for implementation, process design in the context of supply chain management and risk management, Industry 4.0 framework and contributing factors and technologies, key forces for change for operational improvement, and risk barriers, enablers, and digitisation and managing that change. So 1, digital operations and operational improvement strategy for implementation. I took a lot away from this. There's a lot of methodologies out there for implementation. I've used some of these since doing this subject in some of my own businesses. Hence my case studies were on a business that I am, being Newcastle Steel Distributors. Some ones that I did really take away from this in sort of a big management perspective was the Kaizen theory, and obviously being a Japanese philosophy, emphasizing small incremental changes to improve processes, but also to eliminate waste. Another one that I did really find quite intriguing was the business process, or the BPR, the re-engineering. Really interesting concept in terms of basically it's not working, and we need to then look at how do we make that work. Then we look at just in time, for instance, so the JIT, which Toyota Management did for a lot of years, but also you're starting to look at the DAMICO, define, measure, analyze, and improve control. There's some really interesting things in terms of the implementation for those strategies, but also to harness the digital operations from that perspective as well. And then you start looking at process mapping and everything like that as well. But then we start looking also further down the line at enterprise resource planning. And so there's some of those really big factor things that I looked at, and also some of the history as well, like the PDCA in terms of the legacy of that, in terms of when that started, and then obviously that led into other avenues, much like how total quality management started, and that sort of has developed and had offshoots as well. So obviously a digital transformation strategy map, identify the business goals, assess those technologies, determine investments, nurture a digital culture, start with the pilot team or project, and define success and learn define strategy. That's something very much that I did. Again, in my case studies, they were based on a real life scenario of digitization of a steel distributor or processing that I bought. And we looked at digitizing bandsaws and cutting processes like that. So a really interesting thing once we start to look at this implementation from a broad perspective in terms of how do we make those wheels turn. Number 2, process design in context of supply chain management and risk management. Again, we're starting to look at some really interesting things here from supply diversification, key performance indicators. What's that contingency planning looking like in terms of our implementation plan? In inventory management strategies, again, we're starting to look down that sort of that. Is it just in time? Are we looking at agile methods? Are we looking at more of a lean manufacturing perspective in terms of how do we best manage that? Demand forecasting is also another hugely important one, because that can also be context in terms of culture, aging workforce, things like that. So we can start to look at the demand not only now in terms of product and context of customer and supplier, but we can also start to look at workforce management and things like that as well for the future. Obviously, things like reactive risk management is a really huge one as well. That obviously then goes out into real-time monitoring, rapid response systems. Again, we're looking at that. If something does go wrong, how do we do it? The post-incident analysis is really important as well. Looking if things don't go right, how do we manage that? The risk assessment and procurement is also important. We need to be looking at the strategies and the collaboration there about how do we manage that, and cross-functional collaboration. In terms of if we're on a journey with one division within the business, what does that look like? And obviously, how do we do that continuous improvement? What does that look like from an overall implementation strategy for operational improvement? Another good thing that I really liked was Industry 4.0 framework and contributing factors. We started to look at the quantitative and the qualitative benefits and factors there, and we started to look at some of those things that are then supporting those processes that we just discussed in my topic 2 there. We're looking at things such as augmented cloud computing, mobile devices. Again, a lot of this stuff I used in my assessment 1 for the digitization, because this is stuff that we have actually done. We've started looking at human interface, like advanced human machine interfaces, smart sensors, looking at data collecting, look at stock inventory, things like that. Because how do we then take that next step to actually have real-time data that's actually measurable and quantitative? For key forces for change, I'm a really big advocate for change management from the broader perspective. And then we start looking, as you can see the diagram here, key forces for change from Perker and Abram. We start looking at environment, customer, competitive, and also company, but we're looking at it so some of that larger perspective too through our change methodology and operational improvement processes. Now, then we start to talk about the risks, the barriers, enablers, and digitizations, and managing that change. And obviously, there's a number of things here that I've put here that I've really taken away from, such as the resistance to change, the communication breakdown, the lack of resources in terms of what does that look like. The business that I did purchase, it was very much run holistically from 20 years ago. We had to look at what resources we have, how was communication happening. Was there planning? No, there wasn't. It was really inadequate planning. Security concerns about the digitization. How do we do that? They were still running a very old server. It wasn't really fit for purpose. The leadership support wasn't there. And we already knew that. And this subject's made a really good cross of that to really bring what my known knowledge was in terms of business into the future, and then really try to tie this together, which was really great. And obviously, evolving customer needs. We have seen post-COVID, we saw a whole dynamic shift in terms of global market trends and what are those customer needs. And again, some of those key processes that we start to look at, such as lean manufacturing, total quality management. It's really important, even Six Sigma, as to how does this process work for us and how do we get the supplier and the customer on board with this. Then we start to look at enablers or change engines of what does that look like from a broader picture perspective. We need a clear vision and strategy, which again should be defined within the actual change process initially, and obviously that organizational improvement. Effective communication is always a huge one to really onboard people through the process to enable them to come along for the journey, but also to ensure that that consultative process is maintained. The employee engagement, again, is really important from an early step. We need to make sure we get them on board to ensure that we don't have any risks or barriers to the process that we're trying to achieve. We do need strong leadership, and that's obviously led from the top, but it's also about empowering people, much like the Kaizen method, in terms of continuous improvement, that if people see something wrong, they do have that ability to provide that feedback, to change those small things, to enable that process to continue to be improved. The resource allocation is obviously a huge one for us, and I took a lot out of that in terms of it's going to take a lot of effort to make some of this happen, and then we need to start to look at from the big picture perspective, what does that then look like? If we look at the industry 4.0, for instance, in terms of we're looking at sensors, cloud computing, things like all that sort of stuff, that obviously requires support, resource allocation to make that happen, but also the training needs to go into that. We also need to start focusing on user experience. Now, the big perspective here is in my perspective, I've got an aging workforce. The users aren't very acceptable for digitization and change management in that perspective, but the journey that we've got them on, they are having a good experience. We made it simple. We made it sort of so it flows from that perspective. We then need to build a supportive culture, and that's something we're doing here. We're changing culture so that we can then bring that culture forward, so that the culture does embrace change, so it change isn't a foreign thing. And then that's part of that continuous improvement as well. Looking at things like the OODA loop, for instance, where we're looking to that observe, orientate, decide, and act, and then so that we can then start to have that continuous process brought in, so that we really know, are we making the right decisions? Change is a constant thing. The reality is, whilst it may be a project, it is a long-term vision, and that's where things like the Kaizen method, the Six Sigma, really come into their own to really tie that together. The BPR style wasn't really required for a lot of that, and it's not really suitable for the continuous improvement. It's great for it's broken, let's fix it, but it doesn't really tie in well. But overall, I really enjoyed this subject and I got a lot out of it. So thank you.